My guest today, Dinaw Mengistu, is an Ethiopian American novelist and writer. He is the author of 4 award-winning novels: The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, How to Read the Air, All Our Names, and most recently, Someone Like Us, all named New York Times notable books. A graduate of Georgetown and Columbia University, Dinaw was named a 20 under 40 writer by The New Yorker and received the National Book Award Foundation's 5 under 35 award, and also the 2012 MacArthur Foundation Genius Award. As a freelance journalist, Dinaw has written about Darfur for Rolling Stone magazine and for Jane magazine on the conflict in the northern Uganda and eastern Congo. His writing has also appeared in Harper's Magazine, The Wall Street Journal, and numerous other publications. A MacArthur and Guggenheim Fellow, in 2016 he joined the faculty of Bard College, where he is the John D. and Catherine C. MacArthur Professor of Humanities and the founding director of Center for Ethics in Writing.
ሰላም ተመልካቾቻችን እንደምን ሰንብታችኋል? ዛሬ በጣም ትልቅ እንግዳ ይዤላችሁ ነው የቀረብኩት። መግቢያችን ላይ እንደተመለከታችሁት ማለት ነው። ቆይታችንን የምናረገው በእንግሊዘኛ ነው። ያው እንግዲህ ድናው በ2 ዓመቱ ነው ወደዚህ ሀገር የመጣው እና ራሱን በደንብ ኤክስፕረስ ማድረግ እንዲችል ቆይታችንን በሙሉ የምናረገው በእንግሊዘኛ ይሆናል ማለት ነው። Dinaw Mengistu, welcome to Helen Show. Such a privilege, such an honor for me to have you. I've been a big fan. I've been reading your books for years. So it's such a dream for me to be here in New York and have you on our program.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here with you. You've done just so much for our community, and to be a part of that right now is a privilege for me. So I'm incredibly grateful to you.
Thank you for saying that. So let's start from the beginning. You were born in Ethiopia. You left when you were very, very young. Tell us about your childhood, your family, and your early memories of your family coming to the U.S.
So we left. I was roughly 2.5 when we left Ethiopia, and so unfortunately I don't have any memories from that particular period in my life. And when we arrived, my father had already left just before I was born during the Derg. And we arrived, strangely enough, in Peoria, Illinois, which is...
That's such a random place.
Exactly. And the question we always get is why Peoria?
Why Peoria?
A lot of it was just resettlement. You know, there are resettlement agencies. My father had left Ethiopia, went to Italy, where he was granted asylum, and then to the United States. And, you know, they helped him find a job in Peoria, Illinois. We got out. He had... made a home and established a little life for us there. And so that's where we arrived. And, for the first 7-8 years of my childhood, like Peoria that was what I knew, this very particular, rural, semi-rural, but also very racially segregated community. And, my father worked at Caterpillar. We went to a Southern Baptist church because we couldn't find an Ethiopian church, of course. So in many ways, it was a very kind of typical American childhood, but also one that was, sort of very much marked by the fact that we were in a part of America where we never ever expected to be, where we never imagined, and we were far from everyone. When my grandfather died, that's maybe one of the earliest memories I have, because of course he died in Addis, and we were in Peoria, and that distance and seeing the grief of not being able to be there. Really stayed with me, I think, from a very young age.
So how was your family able to balance, having that identity as, like an Ethiopian family? You go to school, you completely different experience. You come home, it's a different experience. How were they able to balance and then, have you keep that heritage or appreciation for the culture, even though everything that you do outside of the home is America?
Yeah, it's a hard question, and I think it's something... families, of course, are still struggling with when we were growing up, because there are no Ethiopians around us. There's no community. Everything that was a part of who we were was just centered inside of our home. And every day my parents would say at least once a day, remember, we're Ethiopians. You don't do that. Remember, we're Ethiopians. But I always joked that they would say that, and then I would go outside and eat hot dogs all day. So what it meant to be Ethiopian was both kind of abstract, but yet at the same time, the things that we sort of loved, the food, of course, the respect for our parents, the way we moved in the world was still kind of deeply rooted in that identity. and when it comes to something like language, like that was, I didn't speak English until I was probably almost 5, and now today I don't speak Marañao, and I can understand it okay, but I think that's where some of that struggle comes from, where you go outside, you're in the world, your parents want to hold on to this culture, to this identity, but it's hard when there's not a community around you. And I think we lost, the loss of language is significant.
It's true.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you always wanted to be a writer? It's, I guess what drew you to storytelling, because the way you tell the story in all of your books, I'm just amazed how you were still able to maintain a lot of the cultural heritage, and it's based primarily about the immigrant experience, most of your books. So was this career that you've always wanted, and was it supported by your family, or were they like a typical Ethiopian family, you need to be a lawyer, a doctor, or an engineer?
Yes. Yeah, I think I wanted to be all of those, a lawyer, a doctor, and an engineer. I think the order was first a doctor, and then at some point, maybe an engineer.
You really wanted to be a doctor?
I think so.
Okay.
But I know it was important to my community that I say that, and knowing that sometimes makes it yours. And I think you want to do something that makes your family proud, that makes your parents proud, and and I think for a long period that is as important as anything else. So I think that belief certainly was real. But also as you grow older, you understand like where your talents are, where your real sort of passions are. And I wasn't going to be an engineer. I did think for a while I would be a lawyer, and when I went to college and I went to Georgetown, the large part of my interests were really in politics. I was very deeply connected to Ethiopian politics, to politics in Africa, and I did think I knew a part of me wanted to be a writer, but I also thought it's okay if I can't. Maybe I'll do that, and that will be really important. But then there comes a point where writing was what I loved. It was as soon as I was, in university and had the time, it became the only thing I wanted to do at that point. And I didn't try to do anything else since then. Yeah.
So it's been ingrained in there. So have you ever been told, because a lot of your stories, or most of your stories, not in your journalism portion, but the fiction that you write, are about the African immigrant experience, most of them specifically about even Ethiopians, right? Have you ever been told, by publishers, I'm sure when you first went, like, why would we be interested in an African immigrant stories? And how did you respond to that? How were you able to push back, having, where you are right now, the success that you have with your books? How did you respond to that?
I think even before somebody told me that, I was certain that was true. And when I first began writing, everything I wrote was about people named Harry and Sarah and Bill and John. And I spent years writing a novel that had nothing to do with our community, with immigrants, with migration, because I thought that's what literature was. And I thought that's what a reader would want to see, and the only way to make something of value was to reflect basically the larger, kind of American white-dominated culture. And it was only when I realized that book was terrible and
terrible for you. Like, remember your editor?
Yeah, it was. I think it was terrible it was a bad book because it had no soul, it had no characters. It had no real engagement with the world, and it was written, I think, more than anything out of fear of what it meant to write a story that actually looked like the people that I knew, that looked like me, that had our names inside of it. So once that book failed, part of me worried that maybe I would never write again, and then it was only a point where I was in DC and I was walking down the street and I heard a voice.
When was this, by the way?
2004.
Okay.
2003, and I heard a voice say, "No one comes into the store anymore," and I saw an Ethiopian man behind the counter of a grocery store, and I began to write the novel that evening, and as soon as I wrote his name, Sefa Stefanos, I knew it was actually a story that I wanted to tell, and as the book grew, really it became a conversation with my family, with our past, with Ethiopia.
But how was the publishing industry in general? To have the kind of support that you've had over the years with all of your books, it's pretty rare for people like us, with our backgrounds, trying to tell these kind of stories. And how did you break through that, the publishing? Yeah.
I don't know if I fully, publishing is a very large, I'm fortunate, and certainly, and, there was the senior person at Random House really believed in the book and began to promote my first novel, and I have a wonderful agent, and I think that helped. I think having readers certainly grow attached to the characters has helped a lot, and so the fact that my first novel has been published almost 20 years ago, and people continue to still read it, and that matters, significantly. And I think there's certainly been a change in the culture of publishing, a little bit, a growing awareness of different types of audiences and different types of readers. But I also worry that sometimes we get very comfortable having one voice, and publishing and businesses, they like having one. And when they have that voice, sometimes that can say, well, look what we've done. We've given you an African voice, or two African writers now. What more do you need? And I think anybody should be, I worry certainly about that space and being a part of that, and filling that space, because it doesn't work if there's only two or three. It only works if we are, many and growing constantly.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. All right, well, let's take a quick break.
Yeah.
We'll come back and continue our conversation. We'll be right back. We're back with Dinaw Mengistu. So when you read, I guess for non-African or non-Ethiopian readers of your book, how do you hope that they're connecting with the immigrant story, with our experiences, and in the characters that you talk about?
I think that's something that's sort of evolved and changed. When I was first writing, I was very somewhat idealistic, and really, things that I still believe, that you can attach and connect to a character regardless of where they come from, if the character is written with real care and precision, that you don't have to be Ethiopian or from the continent or the diaspora to feel like you can understand what these characters go through. And I think that's true, but I also think that sometimes maybe we worry about making ourselves understood to people, and we might write unintentionally in a way that does that takes our stories and maybe projects them or allows them to be interpreted or read in a maybe simpler or more direct way. And over the years now, with my most recent novel, I've and this has been in part as a result of conversations with Ethiopian readers when I do events who sometimes challenge me very, in the best way. Why do I write about Ethiopian characters this way? Why do I tell this story and not that story? And those are really important questions. It's very easy to say as a writer, well, I write because I want to, but to hear the community speak back and to think, what am I writing about and why? And how am I telling these stories? And who am I telling them for? And so with this most recent novel, I thought a lot about how actually, the relationship to an Ethiopian community, to the community in DC, across the country, in the larger community in the diaspora, and what it meant to tell those stories and what it meant to preserve and protect, the kind of complexity and the privacy of our lives, to not feel like I should or need to tell or reveal everything to an audience who doesn't know these characters or where they come from, because I want them to see the immigrant experience. I don't want anybody to read this novel thinking they know our experience. Yeah, because
it's pretty complex.
Yeah, I don't know our experience. Yeah. I mean, I know the variations of it, and I want as much as possible to tell a story that has all of those possibilities inside of it.
Do you feel a sense of responsibility representing these narratives, or in the flip side, we hear some actors say, I've been in comedy my entire career, and I've done this, and now I want to be a dramatic actor, and it's kind of difficult for me to break into this. Do you feel on the flip side that, you're boxed in because a lot of the stories that you've been telling in your novel specifically are about the immigrant experience, the migration, and all of that?
Yeah, I think I used to worry about that about being defined in these terms, right, of being boxed in as in writer of immigrant stories, etc. Because that's not literature for me, doesn't exist as in these genres or forms. But what I've found, and where I hope I am now, is if I'm only writing about community, I don't feel boxed in at all, because the depths inside of our culture, inside of our community, inside of the diaspora experience is so vast and so much larger than anything I've been able to write so far or will ever be able to write. Yeah. So I don't feel boxed in so much as like I'm learning to go deep. And that there's the depth inside of that world is kind of infinite. So if I can continue to go deep, I would love that. I don't think going outside or writing about I don't know, spaceships or Italians is going to give me more substance than what I have now.
So earlier you said for the first book, like the beautiful things that heaven bears, right? You heard a voice, you saw this guy about the store, but for your other books, where do the stories come from? What's the creative process for you, like the writing process for you?
You know, they've all been different. You know, in How to Read the Air, which was my second novel, I was thinking a lot about, you know, questions not only of course migration and diaspora, but you know, there's a memory that I had of growing up with this little cup that said Nashville, and it was from a trip my parents took when they first arrived in America. They went to go to Nashville, Tennessee, to see country music. I'm not sure, but I was fascinated by that desire to want to kind of like to find our way in the world by going out and trying to see it, right? Like, we've come to this country, where are we? And the story kind of emerged from there. But I was also thinking a lot about the price and the toll of migration and what it means to the body, and the way the legacy of that, and then sometimes the violence that people endure gets translated and transmuted and passed on to the next generation. So there's also stories, you know, I'd heard of, you know, of a family friend who had to, you know, make his way from Ethiopia to Sudan, and then out of Sudan inside of a container ship, and he'd hidden in himself, and that image of a person being contained in a box and then emerging, who comes out of that box and what have they had to endure in order to survive that journey. So that novel kind of tried to pull those things together, and then my third novel, All Our Names, you know, by that point I'd done journalism throughout Africa, and I'd seen, you know, several pretty complicated conflicts in Sudan and in northern Uganda, and the memory of those conflicts, and having tried to write about them as a journalist, and feeling like I didn't tell those stories, took shape in All Our Names. I was thinking a lot about, you know, this generation of you know, some of the people that I met who were young soldiers who were fighting, you know, at 15 and 16 years old for the next generation, even though their generation hadn't even grown up yet. And how that...
And what happens to their life after all of that.
Yeah, and how much sacrifice, you know, they are willing to put forward for an idea of a country that might not ever fully exist. And so the novel really began with those characters at the sort of root of it, and trying to recreate the relationship and the intimacy that I saw among some of those young soldiers. And then also to return to America, and remembering my own family's arrival in the US in this small Midwestern town, the people who were there who greeted us, like, you know, the other narrator of the novel is an American woman named Helen, and thinking about their relationship to us. Because it's not just about us migrating to a community, but it's also how that community chooses or chooses not to receive us. So, yeah. That's
kind of how the stories evolve. Do you have any specific ritual? Like, you think of authors, you know, like you'd go somewhere for, like, I don't know, months at a time, you sit down and you come up with a book, or or is that, like, do you have any specific ritual or something uniquely Dinaw?
I wish you know, maybe if I did, I would write more books. You know, when you're young and you're starting off, you feel like you need to, you know, be by yourself, and as you get older and you have jobs and kids
family,
and family.
Kids, yeah.
You pick up a computer, and any spare moment I have to write, I try to find that time. And so I don't worry about the inspiration maybe the same way, but I worry about like how much of a conversation am I having with the novel, and giving myself time. You know, I think it maybe takes me a little bit longer to write these days, but I want to think harder about what I do, and I want to think harder about the community that reads these books, hopefully.
That's great. Were there any authors or books that influenced the way you write? Were there any Ethiopian authors that you've read?
Yeah.
Any plans
Well, you know, when I was
to translate it in Amharic? I want you to tell me all
I
of
wish
this
if
together.
I spoke Amharic and I could translate, that would be such a privilege.
Yeah.
But I remember when I was, in college and really beginning to try to work at writing and wanting, kind of needing, a conversation with Ethiopia and Ethiopian writers and Ethiopian literature, and trying to find those books in translation, and just even a handful of fragments of the lines of poems from his felt like I was holding on. It was like a kind of connection to a literature, even though it was in translation, nonetheless to an experience and to a mood that I needed. So those were the two, and then beyond that, then there was a lot of certainly Baldwin was really important to me growing up. Ralph Ellison and Toni Morrison, Faulkner. Then you sort of read widely and read voraciously. V.S. Naipaul and his very complicated ways of writing about Africa. Because you're looking, but then there was also the fact that there weren't other narratives that could do the stories that I was living.
So beyond fiction, you've reported on conflicts in Uganda, right, Darfur, and you're also a professor, right? You teach. How has your journalism informed your storytelling? I mean, you've been telling us that a little bit about that, but is it a challenge for you to transition from these very serious topics as a journalist reporting on conflicts to now storytelling to something else? Is there a challenge?
Yes. I mean, I didn't expect that the journalism that I've done would shape the fiction that I write, and but I don't think anything has impacted that work probably as much, with the exception of my heritage and my family. The very first time I did a piece of journalism, I went to Sudan during the conflict in Darfur, and it's hard. I struggled to figure out how do I write about this, and coming in, even if I was there for 3 or 4 weeks, you're outside of the experience, and how do you translate all of those stories and all of that loss into a story that you give to an American audience? And I had an idea that what I wanted to do was write about these stories in a way that didn't return to these ideas of ethnic violence and tribal conflicts, but that respected the politics of these situations, that respected also sometimes the remarkable beauty inside of these countries. When I was in Darfur, it's just one of the most remarkable and stunning landscapes. And at that time, of course, you would read descriptions of it as hellish, and you think this is so profoundly beautiful, and how to write about it in a way that gives that truth to those experiences. And I could realize I could do that in a certain way, nonfiction, but that there was more that I could only do in fiction, that there were more stories, more language, more characters that I could only talk about if I found a novel that can hold those experiences. So I think all the novels I've written since then have had a very strong connection to the stories I've seen, to the experiences I've had as a journalist, and most of the time they're trying to do what the journalism couldn't do, and they're trying to kind of bring a fuller, more complex light than what I could do in 5,000 words. And they make me think very hard about how I tell a story and every word that I use, because I know just how degrading sometimes the language that can be used and how it continues to happen. You think there's been a change and a shift, but it's not. I still see the same, language and rhetoric used to describe places that I know are not that.
They're not that, yeah. And so you feel responsibility to present. I mean, I guess you're not, are you a journalist? You don't,
I would be.
At the moment, no, would you say, you've kind of stepped away from that, and do you feel like, oh gosh, I would love to go back and maybe tell these stories in a way that I want to tell them in that journalism capacity?
I wanted to do some more of that. I don't consider myself a journalist so much as I consider myself a writer who cares very deeply about the world as it is, and but also very much in particular with our experiences in Ethiopia, and to a certain degree, the larger context of the continent, and because obviously, Ethiopia is Ethiopia, but the politics of each nation influence, and we impact one another.
That's so true.
So when I write, that's where I want to write, because I do feel responsibility, and I realize that there's something very, very different about being an African journalist writing about a conflict when you're there, the way people see you, the way they talk to you, than it is when
a Western journalist
exactly.
does it.
And you can feel that difference, and having sensed that difference and having had the conversations, I think that's a response. I think to say it's a responsibility is accurate, but it's a gift, right? It's a privilege to be able to feel that that you have that opportunity to hear stories, and that also you are responsible for telling them in the best possible way.
That's fantastic. So we're going to take a break. Yeah. When we come back, I'd love to have a book-by-book conversation about all of the novels, the fictions that you write. So we'll take a break and we'll be right back. We're back. We're continuing our conversation with Dinaw. So I'd love to talk about your books now. So The Beautiful Things That Heaven Bears, 2007, your very first fiction, right? Published fiction. Sefa Stefanos, Ethiopian store owner in DC with his two immigrant friends. As someone who's lived in Washington, DC for over 30 years, I just could connect with all of the neighborhoods, the parallels in the novel, the stores, the gentrification. DC is not the same place that it was when I first moved there, and that it felt like deeply personal for me as I was reading it. How much of his journey reflects your family's experience, and to his friends, his two African friends, their experience is also very similar to a lot of the African immigrants in Washington, D.C., and that sense of belonging and exile. So if you could tell me how much of that was influenced by people in your family and people that you know.
In many ways, his story is on the surface fairly different. Obviously, when I came to Ethiopia, from Ethiopia, I was 2. Sefa comes, when he's about 17, 18. So his life does not mirror our own, but yet as I began to write him more and more, I found all of these ways in which obviously he could have only come from my family's story. So, his name, Sefa Stefanos, is the name my grandfather wanted to give me when I was born. And Stefanos is my grandfather's last name. So once I created that name, I knew I was creating a very kind of intimate connection with him. There's a moment when Sefa kind of remembers the death of his father. And when I was writing that scene, I realized I was, without intentionally doing it, that I was trying to imagine the death of my uncle Shibru during the Derg and what had happened to him. My uncle who, was arrested when he was in high school in Ethiopia during the Derg, and my other uncle who left and walked to Sudan with his friends. All of those stories eventually find their way inside of the novel. That feeling of a country that you've lost, that you didn't ever plan on losing, a country that you imagine you were still going to return to. All of that those emotions were very much rooted in things that I've heard and seen inside of my own family. And then, of course, there's this community of DC and this community of sort of a large and kind of growing Ethiopian diaspora. And my own memories of seeing that diaspora as a young child, in the 80s and watching it again in the 90s, certainly informs his relationship to, to those, all of us living together in some of these apartment complexes, and trying to describe just how kind of remarkable and challenging that can be. So he deviates certainly, but I think in the most fundamental ways, like who he is and how he feels about both America and Ethiopia.
Around sense of place in a city like Washington, D.C. It's a seat of power, but then you have all of these immigrant experiences happening at the same time. And I felt like when I'm reading him, I can relate that that's somebody that I know. You could see it within your family, within the people that you know. So that was very interesting to me. It's a great, fantastic book. The next one was How to Read the Air. And then you kind of shifted in this book, right? Second generation perspective with Jonas Weldamariam. Why did you want to explore that generational divide?
I think some of it is the questions that I was facing of how we tell these stories and how we tell the stories of the generation that preceded us when we ourselves we did not live those experiences, right? The narrator of that novel, Jonas, he's American, born and raised, and yet, he grows up in a family that's very, very much not only rooted in Ethiopia, but also kind of damaged by the legacy of migration, right, and the toll that it took on his family, and that legacy of political violence that we experience that becomes intimate enough where it gets turned into a domestic violence, where it moves from something that happens by the state to something that we begin to inflict upon each other. And Jonas's and that story, those were hard things to write about. But I felt like I wanted to find a way to do that, and I wanted to put them into this very particular American landscape of the sort of the Midwest where I'd grown up, and the challenges of finding yourself inside of this landscape and wondering who you are. And
very interesting character. He kind of played fast and loose with the truth.
Completely.
Not reliable. Just fudging everywhere. Whenever he's dealing with difficult things, he was fudging the truth in there. And what do you think that says about are these inherited memories that we as immigrants, because we kind of want to move away from some of these experiences that we sometimes fudge it a little bit or change the narrative a little bit, and sometimes it becomes untruth. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think part of the untruth proceeds because there's already a world that's trying to consume our stories, that wants our stories to fit into a certain package of what the good immigrant is, who comes to America and does everything they can to succeed, and who has fought for democracy or whatever the case may be. And so there's already, I think, an idea of what the good immigrant story is. And that idea means, I think, sometimes we lie already because we're asked to do so.
And you have to fill out your application for,
for everything,
for immigration.
And then when you're in the world and people ask you, like, where are you from? They don't always really want to know the complex truth. They want a simplified version of, I came because of X, Y, and Z. And so I think the distortion happens even without Jonas. For him, the lying is a way to protect himself. It's a way to create a barrier between him and the rest of the world. It's a way to not have to actually confront the truth of some of the experiences he's had to live through. But it's also a way of of not allowing the story to be controlled by others, of not allowing somebody to say, well, I know your immigrant experience because I read this. Because if what you read or heard isn't true, then they can't pretend that they know you.
That's so true. And you also explore the emotional distance within families in that book, right? The relationship of his parents, their marriage. It seems like, everything is happening in secrecy, although they're all living and experiencing it. That silence is very traditionally in our community. You don't want to talk about this, so you pretend and you exist in a space without having to face it or deal with it. Why did you think that was important to explore?
Well, because I think, when the price of not being able to do that, to not being able to talk, is hard, and it takes a toll on the people, on us, and have to live inside of that. I think there's a good reason sometimes to both understand and respect why we can be private, why we have a culture that doesn't want to reveal itself openly to others, because we protect each other and we protect one another. And there's a sort of a beauty inside of that.
Or yulunta, you know, like
Yeah.
how you don't want somebody to know this, or so many lengal is another word, like we don't want people to know this truth. Then if they know the truth, they
gossip, they judge. Yeah.
It's difficult as a fact. Our family name, we have to protect our reputation and who we are, so we'd rather exist in that space in silence, would you say?
That's exactly. But at the same, you know, and that space comes at a price. And how to make more room for us to be able to say what's wrong sometimes. Every family struggles, and to not be ashamed of that, and to feel like we actually have the right to, you know, to talk openly and honestly about what we've endured, because that is the only way we move forward. That is the only way the next generation doesn't repeat the same mistakes of the past.
That's true. That's true. So the next novel, the third one, is All of Our Names. It's a little bit different, right? It also talks, you know, there's love in it, there's revolution. They're moving between post-colonial Africa and current Africa. What inspired these dual narratives?
Yeah. You know, some of it was what I mentioned, you know, being a journalist and having seen, you know, these young soldiers who are putting their lives out there and for, you know, for a better world, and trying to, you know, give a representation of that. But then also thinking about America and its relationship to Africa, and, you know, and our own kind of incomplete civil rights legacy here, and the similarities between those two. Oftentimes we imagine like this happened in America and everything else is out there, but realizing that, you know, that period, the post-colonial moment, there was, you know, not only so much hope for a better world, you know, in Africa, but also in the United States, and watching how that idea and those dreams, you know, came head to head with a reality that didn't allow that to fully happen. So that was part of the genesis of that. And then, you know, there's always a part of you that's inside of the story. And in this case, a part of me was remembering, you know, this very particular Southern Baptist community that we lived in Peoria, Illinois, and remembering just how strange it was that they...
What was strange about it?
Well, that they even opened their doors to us. They were not used to having, you know, immigrants, black people, Ethiopians, any of those. So those were all new.
Oh, so it's a white Baptist. Oh, I thought it was an African American Baptist.
No, that would have been, yeah. No, it was an entirely white one. And,
okay.
And I, you know, later on I went back to that church and to visit this woman who really was a fantastic, who embraced us, who helped my parents when we were, you know, when they needed babysitters, all of these really interesting things. I thought, well, what a remarkable version of an America that I worry doesn't exist right now, that opens itself up to the stranger, to the immigrant, and that makes room for them inside of their communities, rather than doing what we do now, which is to ostracize, condemn, terrorize. And it hadn't gotten that bad when I was writing that novel.
Yeah, that wasn't my experience either when it first came.
So, yeah.
Things have definitely changed.
They changed dramatically.
All right, so let's take a quick break and we come back. And then we're going to talk about your new novel. We're going to talk about that. We'll take a break and we'll be back. Thank you. All right, so we're back, continuing our conversation with Dinaw. Congratulations on your latest book, Someone Like Us. After nearly a decade, right? 10 years later is when you're writing this book. What drew you back to fiction, and why did it take this long to give us another book?
I never stopped writing. I think this book, just as it began to grow, just demanded more and more. It wasn't, it didn't come easily, and it needed the time. I think I needed to mature and grow up, and you know, we had 2 little children who were also, you know, needed attention and you know, having room
in
your
father.
life. You're a father, and you know, we had a 2 and a 3-year-old, or 1 and a 2-year-old, and so that certainly takes a certain amount of energy. But I think probably fundamentally was it just required a maturity. It required a kind of a depth and a kind of a thought process that made me slow down dramatically the way I wrote. And the revision, I mean, I revised the book so many times. When I thought I was done, I realized I wasn't right, and there was still questions and challenges that I wanted kind of force the book to reconcile with. So I kept revising it and rewriting it, and you know, and I'm very happy, I think, where what it reflects right now, you know, and how it reflects all of that work.
That's fantastic. So the story follows Mamush,
Yeah.
right? Affectionately named Mamush,
Yes.
who returns to Washington, D.C. From Paris. He has a wife, a baby, death of a father figure, which his name is Samuel, right? A cab driver. With just this unrealized American dream, and then it unfolds over 3 days. Yeah. Just a fantastic, I just couldn't put it down. There's addiction, there's unresolved trauma in this book. How much of the experiences of these characters relate to the first book that you had, a uniquely immigrant experience, yes, but how much of it is a human experience, and how is it connected to your first book?
Yeah. It's very, you know, it's. I didn't realize how connected it was to the first book until I think I was almost finished with it. You know, certainly both books are centered in you know, in D.C. and Maryland and Virginia. But I think, you know, when I was writing the first book, I was subconsciously probably afraid and reluctant to put, you know, the Ethiopian community and experience at the center of the narrative.
Why?
I don't know. I think maybe some of that initial question of, some of it is a question of whether or not your own, the right to do that, right? Do you have, how much authority do you have to actually tell those stories? But I think maybe some of it is that question you'd asked earlier about who's on the other side reading this book. And you worry, I think, you know, and again, it's a very subconscious, because I think these ideas seep so far into us, we sometimes don't even see them. That if I write too much about the specific community, that no one's going to want to read it, that it will lose some of its universality, which is the opposite of what's true. It's writing specifically about the community that allows it to go beyond that. So in this book, I think I knew from very quickly that I wanted to be there. Like, I wanted to be inside of our homes, inside of our conversations, inside of our struggles, inside of our dreams and the ambitions we brought to this country, and sometimes the failures, but also to see the success, right? There are, you know, the narrator's mother, you know, she lives a kind of what a lot of Ethiopians right now live, right? She's successful. She has a large home in the suburbs, and we're not struggling to find our place in the world. But it doesn't mean we don't have other struggles that we also have to confront.
That's true. There's a moment when Samuel says to Mamush, like, there's no mental illness in Ethiopia, right? He said to him, there are no addicts, there are no alcoholics. So there's this denial, to me, feels very familiar to our community, or maybe it's because we're trying to avoid it or don't want to think about it. Why do you want to explore these hidden, it's not uniquely to, you know, to our community there, obviously.
Of course.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I think, I don't know, I mean, I've seen this happen, of course, with other immigrant communities where, you know, we are on guard. And I think we're on guard in part because we worry about who's outside watching us. And we know that there's a legacy and a history of profound racism in this country, and that there are constant attempts to diminish us, to judge us. Not because of who we are, but because of, you know, the color of our skin, because we come from another country. So I think we are aware of that and cautious of that, but at a price sometimes, right? And I think we have to be able to recognize that, like any community, you know, these issues are very real inside of our community. And I also know in Ethiopia we have the same reluctance to talk about, you know, the challenges our children face, the questions of addiction, questions of you know, of depression, right? These real, you know, mental health problems that are present everywhere in the world, and that even in America are very, very hard to talk about. You know, like, addiction is not something that, you know, we talk about honestly in this country. Depression is not something we talk about honestly.
Avoidance, all of those things.
Yeah. Yeah.
Interesting. The other parallel in the story, in the book, is your wife is from France, like Paris. Mamush's wife is also Parisian, right? She lives in Paris. And he has a kid. You have 2 kids. And you've lived in Paris as well, right, at some point? So is there a reason, like, why did you decide to have those parallels? And in the book, your wife also even contributed. Like there are some photos throughout the book. To me, help me understand the story even better when I'm looking at those pictures, or at least it opened up my imagination when I'm reading it, right? So why did you feel the need to add those parallels in there?
I mean, there's, like I said in the first novel, Seifa Stefanos was the name, that my grandfather had wanted to give me. Mamush is the name that my family has always called me, even now.
Oh, so you're Mamush.
I'm Mamush. And so there's I think I've always put myself inside of the narrative in some way, to hold myself accountable to how I find a connection to the story that feels honest and feels very emotional and very private to me. It takes me so many years to write a novel. I want to know that I care about these characters as much as I care about the people who actually live in my world. But also, in this novel, because I knew that I was talking about very difficult issues, that I was writing about depression and suicide, that I could, people could know that I was accountable inside of the story. That if I'm not just writing about you, I'm writing about me as well. And that accountability is really important for me to have. That's, if I'm going to write about a community, I don't want to feel like I'm doing it with some position of authority, that I'm standing outside looking in. I want you to feel like I am inside of the story as well, along with you. And if something goes wrong, I am as responsible for that failure as I am the one who's responsible, and that.
Yeah, of course. And you also talk about how to process grief, and the way, from the way how they're grieving his new wife, and how Mamush's mom is processing or understanding his death. It's just the dynamic, their characters, to me, is fascinating, but I also see it within my family, within people that I know. Yeah, this is sort of how we all manage grief and disappointment and family history, and it's important for you to do to show that.
I mean, because those are such intimate emotions and feelings, and sometimes the hardest ones to actually give life to. Something really hard for me to acknowledge that, the sort of that level of grief, and that opening up that space inside of the novel felt also like opening up room for also the joy and love that these characters also have. For all of that, there is. I was also very much animated by, the memories of, my family and their friends, and the kind of like really quiet but like loving care that has always existed in our worlds.
Of course. And so how was it like working with your wife and asking her to, to include her, collaborate with you in this project? How was that like?
It was, it happened it happened very organically and very slowly. I loved the idea of what it meant to have somebody talk to a character, not through words, but through images, and to have another artistic voice in the story. But then as it began to grow, I thought, well, it's maybe really important for the characters, the narrator's wife, to have a voice in the story that he does not control. And by extension, which I, as the author, do not control. So I would write a scene and I would show it to my wife, and I would say, can you make something? Like, can you do something with this? And she would make a photograph, and I was very careful to make sure that she had complete autonomy and control over what the images looked like, over how they were made. So you didn't say, this
is what I want?
Never. Okay. Because that was the only way to actually have a real voice in the story that's not mine. You can, these characters are constantly telling stories. They exist in their own, the worlds that they invent and the stories that they tell. I imagine that's a way for the characters to kind of talk back to the reader, to say, you think you're going to know me, but I'm not going to give you everything. I'm not going to tell you everything. And that's something very true in our community.
Yeah, of course.
We're not going to give you our whole life story right away. We will maintain our privacy, and there's a dignity behind that as well. But I'll give you this, and there's humor and play. And so her photos are an extension of that. They're another character who's coming inside the story, and it's like, my voice will be mine, and I didn't control that, and it gives that, his wife, I hope, like a real presence in the story that's not his to dictate.
That's great. How has being a father of two girls influenced or informed the way you write? Has it changed you now that they're teenagers?
Without a doubt. I think, I mean, I think a lot about how, how we still maybe need more stories about what it means about fatherhood and about that change that, the next generation should and can have on us. For me, certainly, I think a lot about, the stories that I want them to be able to hear. And I think there's important questions to be asked and addressed about the courage sometimes it takes to tell difficult stories, right? And how to hopefully give them, a legacy that allows them to feel like they can. The last thing I think we want to do is keep who we are private entirely to ourselves. I think I want them to grow up in a world where they can be proud of who they are, where they can also feel like they have the ability and the capacity to tell that story, not to please anybody else, but because it is a reflection of this really rich and kind of complicated culture that they've grown inside of.
That's great. In what ways do you think, someone like us contributed to the current conversation around diversity, inclusion? The landscape has changed significantly in the U.S. right now after the election. Yeah. So is there some connection that you see?
Yeah, when I was first writing the novel, the early versions were during the first administration, and there's Samuel's character has a dream of creating a taxi cab company that will get people who know that they are not safe to someplace safe, and that was very much born out of a growing awareness of just how vulnerable our immigrant communities can be in this country. And Samuel knows that, and he's trying to find a way to address that issue, and he's felt that certainly himself. What we see now is that magnified to a degree I wouldn't have thought possible, right? That anxiety, that insecurity, that feeling that you might not be safe if you go outside
you don't
of your
belong,
own house.
Yeah.
That fear was, I think, sort of present in many ways for a long time, but now, it's like that fear was real. And they've confirmed that, with the wrong change of government, like we will employ the powers to make you feel that fear. So I think, I wish that wasn't the case, but that was such an important part of, I think, of how Samuel understood the world as a place that was potentially really great, but also he knew that this country could turn on you. And he wanted to try to find a way to fix that.
That's true. So, so much of our stories are not really being told. You said you're one of the top two, like very few writers of your caliber right now that tell our stories. What advice do you give to young writers that really want to be in this space, but don't necessarily feel like, okay, my stories have value? Yeah. Would they be accepted? And any advice for young writers that you can offer?
What's been great recently that I haven't seen to the same degree is actually the number of Ethiopian writers right now that are working and writing and getting ready to finish or trying to finish their first novels or essays or poems. So I'm profoundly hopeful and optimistic about an entirely new generation and wave of writers who are going to just make this landscape so much richer and better. And I think obviously the more of us there are, the more freedom we have to write. But I also think, to be brave and tell the story that you want to tell. Do not tell the story that you think others want to hear. Think very hard about what matters to you, and write out of that conviction, right? Write out of that belief, because it's the only reason to do it, right? There's the only reason why and how these stories will matter.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, Dinaw, thank you so much.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you for making the time for us. Someone Like Us is available everywhere. I loved it, and I hope many of you, our viewers, get a chance to get the book, read it, and enjoy it for yourself as well. So thank you. I appreciate it. And then I hope one day we'll see it in Amharic, translated in Amharic, everywhere in Ethiopia, right?
And I hope I'm having that conversation in Amharic with you.
Oh, next time, okay. I'll hold you to it, so thank you so much.
Thank you.
All right, everyone, that's our show for today. We'll see you next time on an all-new episode of Helen Show. Thank you.